The next step in making the drapery is to create a curtain rod, and I'll do that in the left viewport where I can see through the loops. Here I'll create a cylinder object centered within the loop. Go back to perspective and move that curtain rod over, and then increase the height so that it sticks through the other side. I'll give it 50 height segments so that it has ample topology to hang the curtain on. I'll rename it Rod, and I'll make it gray. Then I'll select the drapery and assign the cloth modifier. Go to Object Properties to open the dialog box. Select the drapery, set it as cloth, and use a preset. Let's make this satin. We'll add another object, which will be the rod, and the rod will be a collision object. OK. So we're set up to do our simulation, but before we get going, I recommend that you turn off gravity, because the first thing that we want to do is to get the loops to look more realistic. And without gravity, nothing will fall. The seams will merely be drawn in closer together. We're using the sewing springs to do this work. I'll click on Simulate Local, and you'll see that those seal up. I'll turn that off, and then let's turn gravity back on and turn off the sewing springs. Before we do too much, I'd like to be careful here, because the cloth will have a tendency to fall through the curtain rod. What I'd like to do is make the simulation proceed just a little further so that the curtain starts to drop, but I'm going to stop it when the loops look like they're at the top of the rod. So I'll click on Simulate Local, and I'll stop it right now. That way, nothing has dropped through the rod, and it started to take on the shape of a curtain, but not fully yet. It's at this point that I'd like to fix some of the vertices onto the rod so that we can be sure that it's not going to drop through the rod. Go into the front viewport and zoom in. Expand the cloth modifier, and you'll see that it has lots of different sub-object levels too. Go to the group level and select the vertices up here where they intersect the rod. And then click Make Group. Call it Loops. OK. So down here it says Loops is unassigned. We've merely identified a selection of vertices as a group. I'd like to attach that to a node of the simulation, so I'll click this button and then click the rod. So now it says loops are sim-noded to the rod, which means essentially that they're attached to the rod now, and we don't have to worry about the loops falling through the rod. You see that could happen because the number of vertices in the rod is not very great, and some of the vertices here could slip between them and actually fall off the rod. So I'll go back to the top level and go back to perspective. Let's continue the simulation and see what happens. So gravity is allowing the cloth to spring, and because we use satin, we have more springiness in the fabric. I'll stop it here. And now the next thing to make this look more realistic would be to pull the drapes closed. We can do that now because we've attached the vertices of the loops to the rod. Here's how you do it. Turn on Auto Key and go to the last keyframe. That takes you to frame 100. Select the rod and scale it down in the X direction, like this. Then turn off Auto Key and you can play the animation. The animation is very simple. It consists of the rod getting shorter. Now click on Simulate, and the simulation will take place over all of those frames, and you'll see that the curtain starts to get pulled closed because of the vertices on the rod are getting closer together. And natural folds are starting to appear in the drapery. We'll let this go all the way to the last frame, which is 100 frames by default. That should be enough to get some realistic looking drapes. So this simulation takes place over the keyframes, so it's stored in the keys. If we scrub the time slider, you'll see that the drapes are closing. So what we need now is to capture a freeze frame moment of this animation as a static object. Go to the Tools menu and use the Snapshot tool. Create a single snapshot. Actually, I did that wrong. I'm going to undo. I had the rod selected. I need to select the drapery and take a snapshot of it. I'll click OK, and that should create a new object. I will hide the selection, and we will be left with drapery 01, which is now an editable mesh. It's a static object that does not change across the course of the animation. I could apply an HSDS modifier to make it look a little better. I'll use adaptive subdivision with high parameters, and that's looking pretty good. Perhaps I'll assign a material to that. I'll assign a material and give it a diffuse map of a bitmap. And I'll just use one of these standard patterns here. I'll use pattern 19 and show it on the surface. I'll tile it up maybe 40 times in each direction. And maybe that's too much. I'll say 10 times. And you can see that that pattern follows the contours of the curtain, and it looks very natural. So there you have it. Drapery made with the Garment Maker and cloth modifiers.